It is my pleasure to introduce my friend and fellow Q aficionado, Dr. Jim Rhoads, to present today for our series on cultivating Q methodology essays honoring Stephen Brown. Jim is a professor of political science at Westminster College, which is in Pennsylvania. And he is still serving as chair of both political science and criminal justice and sociology. He earned his BA, MA, and PhD at Kent State University, where his dissertation was directed by Steve Brown. He has published numerous articles, and he has twice served as president of the International Society for the Scientific Study of Subjectivity, and is currently the past president of I4S. Jim was also one of the co-editors of the text, and he was co-author of not one but two different chapters in the book. But today he will be discussing chapter 9, the Operantcy of Popular Culture, Preserving while Measuring Key Informant Subjectivity, which was authored with Jim and Dan Thomas, Bruce McKeown, and Daniel Sundblad. So without further ado, take it away, Jim.
All right. Well, thank you all. And thank you, Sue. First of all, I want to express my deep appreciation to the organizers of the ZoomQ who made the decision to devote a number of their sessions to the Festschrift. Appreciate that so much. I was saddened that I was unable to participate in the fall because I had a class that ran opposite this time, but I'm glad to finally join the group to make this presentation. And I trust everyone can see the PowerPoint. As Sue mentioned, the title of this is The Operantcy of Popular Culture, Preserving while Measuring Key Informant Subjectivity. And this research is a number of years old now. It grew out of a desire to try to make students of popular culture more aware of the promise of Q methodology in those efforts. And we went to some conferences and authored some papers and so forth. And what we discovered, not only the group of four here, but Steve Brown went once to a popular culture conference with us. And I know Tom Robinson from BYU and his colleagues have been to several. Tom was on this original panel. And what we discovered was that there is a great hesitancy among longtime scholars of popular culture to anything with a number. When they see quantitative measurements and quantitative analysis, they go running screaming into the night. And it's because they have this view, and it's not altogether misguided, that quantitative measures will be reductionist in their approach to people's reactions to expressions of popular culture. It's because, quite naturally, they're thinking of our methodology. And we share that skepticism as far as conventional methods go in the study of popular culture. But what they didn't quite realize was that Q methodology can preserve, of course, that subjectivity while being able to measure it in a scientific way. And so we're making small incremental inroads among the popular culture scholars. I wondered if I was out of my element when I flew to a popular culture conference once in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I happened to be sitting next to a young woman who was also going to the conference. And I asked her what her field was. And she said, well, my day job, I'm a librarian, but my real expertise is I'm a Harry Potter scholar. And I thought, oh, Okay, all right, that's pretty narrow in the slice of popular culture. But she was excited to go to this conference in Albuquerque because they had probably 7 or 8 panels devoted to Harry Potter and people's reactions to Harry Potter and so forth, and what do these books mean, and so, and all of that. Well, just as, again, a little bit of background, remember what Stevenson said, and, among other things, about operant factors. And he said, I come to operant factors, by which I mean factors which have no critical dependency on test construction effects. Suppose, for example, that subjects are asked to look over a set of mental tests, not to perform them, but merely to say which interests them most, as most worth performing. The set was not constructed with this operation in kind, yet subjects readily perform Q sorts representing their interests as required. Duly factored, the resulting factors are operant. Contrast this with our methodology, typified by scaling, where subjects are assigned scores based on responses to items presumed to have fixed meanings. And then there's Brown and Taylor, who were instructive when they wrote in 1972, the need to create a dimension grows out of the assumption, which we are not sure is correct, that a concept needs an operational definition before measurement can begin. From that initial assumption grows the need to reach agreement on the definitions used, and to the eventual acceptance of verbal agreement as equivalent to conceptual agreement. Operational definitions immediately inject indeterminacy on both sides of the research enterprise. Not only are we uncertain what different respondents bring to the scale, for respondents have their own operational definitions of concepts, however crude and unsophisticated they may be. But we are also uncertain of the different meanings that may be implicit in the scale as operationally defined by the investigators. So again, this calls to our attention the idea that we, what our methodology does, and particularly scale measurement, is they come at this problem or topic with the idea that the scale measures what they say it measures. And so that takes the subjectivity, of course, of the respondents out of it. One last aspect before we get to some of the findings. That is the 4 authors of this study, contend that the meaning of popular in popular culture should be subject to popular determination by everyday participants, instead of scholarly experts working independently of or detached from key informants of that culture. Now, that's not to say there's not a role for scholars of popular culture to do what they traditionally do, but they seem to ignore quite regularly, again, the everyday participants. And so we think that's a shortcoming in their approach. And then finally, Brown, Danielson, and Van Exel remind us that in a science of subjectivity, the observer is the Q sort, who is the only person in direct contact with his or her own point of view, and therefore the only person who can directly inform on it. So again, that ties into this idea that the everyday person should be involved at some level in determinants about popular culture. So in the chapter, you'll find 2 exemplifications, only one of which we're going to talk about today, but 2 television programs, Breaking Bad and Jersey Shore. And we take very similar approaches in the study of both. But today we're going to focus on Breaking Bad. And for those of you who have not seen it, it was a television series that ran first in the United States, and I suspect throughout the world by now, ran from 2008 to 2013. And it featured a mild-mannered high school chemistry teacher whose character's name was Walter White and portrayed by Bryan Cranston, who upon a diagnosis of lung cancer turns into the Southwest's most prolific master manufacturer of high-quality methamphetamines. Thus, he broke bad. Now, the show, of course, for those of you who've seen it can attest, is pretty complicated, and it has many twists and turns. And when Bryan Cranston's character, Walter White, starts down this path, he knows nothing about the drug trade. But he has a former student who is a petty criminal, always running afoul of the law, and he helps him along the way with contacts and so on and so forth. But Cranston, as a chemistry teacher, knows how to create the drug, and pretty soon he ascends to a pretty prominent role in the drug trade. And so he goes from this guy who's just dipping his feet into this, basically to try to keep his family financially afloat when he passes away. So this is what he does in that instance. So we were familiar with an article by Michelle, who identifies 4 modes of audience reception. And she identifies these modes as the transparent mode, the referential mode, the mediated mode, and the discursive mode. In the transparent mode, audiences respond to the presentation as what she calls text as life. So this is really character identification. People watch a program and they identify either positively or negatively with a character or characters. The referential mode has to do with text as lifelike. It's when an audience member puts themselves in the situation and either says, yes, that's how I would have acted, or no, that's not how I would have acted, given that scenario. The mediated mode is text as production. What's the cinematography like? How is the acting? All of the kinds of things that enter into a program or a play or film. And then finally, the discursive mode, text as message, right? What is the program trying to say, if anything? So we thought that was a pretty good place to start as we began to gather hundreds of statements. And we gathered these statements from reviews of the program by critics and internet commentary by fans, bulletin boards, and so forth. Back in this time, the IMDb Internet Movie Database, they used to have forums for each of the programs, and people could write their comments about an episode or a television show or an actor or actress. Those things have gone away, the bulletin boards have, because they required constant monitoring and people were saying awful things and so forth, and so they removed them. But at this time, that was available to us, as well as all of the public commentary that would be written in the New York Times and in the Washington Post and so forth, in response to a critic's article on Breaking Bad. So we had a wealth of commentary. And so we began to break this down. We took 10 statements from each of these 4 modes, representative of each of these 4 modes, as provisional placement. Again, not believing for an instant that they necessarily had to hang together. People are going to do what they're going to do with these statements. We found 35 self-identified Breaking Bad fans, all ages, many of whom, almost all of whom, had seen every episode. And we got them to do the Q sort. And there are 3 factors that emerged, and we'll discuss those in just a bit. And there's a picture of someone doing a Q sort, although I suspect everyone here knows how that's done, but here's an example of the Breaking Bad score sheet. This is what it looked like. You can see it's relatively flat. There, again, were 40 statements. And then this is some of the data. You can see the different ages, mid 30s to upper 60s, late 50s, and so forth. We asked them what was the percentage of the television program, percentage of Breaking Bad that they'd watched. You can see, at least on this page, almost everybody's 100%, couple at 95% and 85 and so forth. We asked them to name their favorite character and their favorite episode. And what was amazing were these people were so devoted to the television program that in almost every instance, they knew the name of the episode that they liked the most. That they knew Face Off, they knew Felina, they knew Fly. It was, it amazed me that they were that devoted to the program. We also asked them to list their least favorite characters and asked them if they had weekly conversations with other people about Breaking Bad, because this was one of the things that interested us from the very beginning. During this time period, early 21st century, there was a plethora of programs on that were identified as good TV. It was seen as a renaissance of sort of golden age of television. And so there was a lot of programs that were aired that people would talk about in the way that maybe they used to talk about, years ago, programs like The Fugitive or something like that. So now you're getting in your office or you're in your dormitory and you're talking about the latest episode. And we asked them too if they had watched other TV shows that had been identified by critics as good TV, Mad Men, The Wire, and Weeds. And then finally, we asked them to rank the final episode, because the final episode was, as most final episodes go of beloved series, it had a division of opinion about it. All right, so that's some of the data. And then we also asked them, this is just more, let me see, yep, sorry. We asked them gender, their age, of course, again, the percentage. These are all the questions that you saw represented in the chart. So there were three orientations of viewers among these diehard Breaking Bad fans, and we called the first discursive viewers. Breaking Bad is morality play, right? And that tied to one of Michelle's 4 modes. Then there were character identifiers, embracing the anti-hero, and we'll talk about why it's embracing the anti-hero when we go through it. Again, reflective of one of the modes. But then factor C, men at work, play and hard-nosed criticism, not directly linked to one of the 4 modes. So in discursive viewers, we had 12 Q sorts, 7 men, 5 women. Again, it ties to text as message. And Breaking Bad required contemplation and reflection, as all good texts do. Worthy of critical acclaim, carries a profound message about the moral dilemmas that confront humanity. So to give you a sense of what they were agreeing with here, on the surface, Breaking Bad is a show about a high school chemistry teacher turned drug kingpin. The series, however, has a depth far beyond its subject matter and presents a meditation on morality that can resonate with anyone. The classic moral principle that functions in the story is the sinner falls ever deeper into sin. Walt wasn't sucked in, he dived in. Breaking Bad lets us root for the underdog genius in his tighty-whities until we realize we may have developed sympathies for the devil. And there's some few inflection points in the series when that really comes home. And you see, because it's a slow evolution of Walter White. He first gets into this thing, as I say, as a desperate means to try to keep his family financially afloat. But then the role overtakes him and he becomes quite evil as things go forward. The Emmy Award-winning series has a depth far beyond its subject matter, and that fact is well documented by its critical acclaim and the serious nature of its audience. Breaking Bad revealed in excruciating detail how capable human beings are of self-delusion. Walt was a living, breathing example that ordinary people are capable of great evil under the right circumstances. All right, so for these viewers, it's a morality play. They watch these episodes and they see it in a much deeper way. Factor B, made up of 8 men and 2 women, are character identifiers. They place themselves in the story, and that's its appeal. They are similar to factor A in that they are looking at, these circumstances and how would I act and how would I behave. But we say it's more relaxed because it's comforted by the fact that this is fiction, right? There's a playful quality to it because they realize the stakes are not real. I will continue to root for Walt, even though I know he did terrible things with inadequate moral justification. Fortunately, it's only fiction, isn't it? So this is their way of absolving themselves from, the notion that, oh, I'm really rooting for some guy who's pretty bad. The power of the show lies in the way people regard Walt, wondering what they would do in his place with his gifts, opportunities, and troubles. His confession that he did it for himself is a masterful dramatic moment, and viewers could feel in their hearts the glamour of evil. There is a moment in the series where he is finally confronted by his loved ones who discover his double life. And, they had discovered it, and he had said, I'm doing this for the family and so on and so forth. And then through a series of events, it becomes clear to everyone, and including Walt, that that's not entirely true. And it's taken on more, and he enjoys his infamy as a big drug dealer. Live a long and peaceful life, Jesse Pinkman. You're a good boy in your heart. Jesse Pinkman is the young man who helps Walter White, and he's really truly a lost soul. He's taken advantage of by everybody in his life, including, of course, Walter. Our society generates people like Walter White all the time. Smart, intelligent people who feel underpaid and underappreciated in a macho culture that traditionally favors the brawny hero. We are beginning to see, and we make comment at the end of the chapter about this identification with Walter White is sort of the anti-hero. The notion is that, and again, we'll make reference to it later, but remember what's going on in the world at that time. There's an economic collapse that's going on. 2007, 2008, the worst economic collapse since the Great Depression. And there are a lot of people who have lived all their lives between the lines, and maybe vicariously they're rooting for somebody who is going outside those lines at a time when the world seems to be falling apart. Jesse Pinkman was in some ways the moral center of the show. He was trying to do the right thing, but he was the broken child who had been led astray by this bad dad. I don't know why I found myself identifying with and even excusing the immoral choices Walt made. Though his actions were evil, I found myself wanting him to succeed. Some of this, of course, is tribute to the extraordinary acting skills of Bryan Cranston. And with a lesser actor, I'm not sure we would have found that. Then there is factor C, and these were all males. And this was both a mixture of Texas production and Texas life. But it's really a criticism in some ways of people who are wrapped up tremendously in this show. They consider themselves viewers who got the series, but they don't get all of the hullabaloo. You know, they think it's an interesting show. They think it's well acted. They like the show. They watch the show, but it's a television show, you know, and why get all worked up over it? They are also preoccupied with Skylar, who is Walter White's wife. And for these viewers, they absolutely hate Skylar, Walter White's wife. And I watched the show, and there were times, of course, when she, like other characters in the show, could be annoying. But I never quite understood the depth of the just disdain that these viewers had for Skylar. Because after all, she was a victim of Walter White as well. It was a great show, but let's stop trying so hard to pigeonhole it as anything but great entertainment artfully done. Why are we debating the morality of a fictional television character whose creators cleverly turned moral ambiguity into the hook they needed to entertain and thereby sell ads? As far as Skylar's character goes, it's only human to get angry and sick by following all the rules when other people, namely your husband, keep disappearing and lying about it over and over again. But throughout the Q sort, you'll see, you would see, and you can see in the chapter, very critical statements about Skylar. So the meaning of what constitutes the popular in popular culture should at least be subject to popular determination by everyday participants in that culture. Three orientations of viewers emerge in the context of Michelle's four modes of audience reception. The attraction among audience members drawn to Breaking Bad as good TV seems to be rooted in the show's characters, particularly Walter White himself. An additional point of similarity are the ethical dilemmas presented in the series, and there are any number of them. There appears to be a common message in these data that speak to a larger confluence of factors that, taken into context, account for this show's popularity at this time in American history. This is what I was referring to earlier about the economic period that people were experiencing when this show was most popular. And I guess we're wondering whether if this show had come out 10 years earlier or something, whether it would have been as resonant. Gilligan is the producer of the program. The success Gilligan's full-throated celebration of Breaking Bad and its precursors, especially The Wire and Weeds, make cultural, sociological, and pop cultural sense. Weeds was for those of you who haven't seen it, Weeds had a similar plot line in that Mary Louise Parker, who plays the central character in Weeds, was a mother of two, a homemaker, whose husband went out for a jog and had a heart attack and died. And all of a sudden, she is in this suburban home, really with no employable skills. And how is she going to keep the family into the lifestyle that they are accustomed? And instead of getting job training or going back to school, like I suspect we would have all done, she decides she's going to deal marijuana. And she too gets wrapped into it, and as the series progresses, becomes more and more. The parallels are pretty similar. It's the difference between Breaking Bad and Weeds is in its tone. Weeds is at heart a comedy with some dramatic moments, but Breaking Bad is more of a drama with some comic moments every now and again. And Weeds, as popular as it was, I don't think was ever the phenomenon that Breaking Bad was. And it might be because of the economic situation was much different when Weeds was at its height and than the later Breaking Bad. So with the macroeconomic environment in a free fall, is it any wonder that popular culture would turn in a way that signified a loss of cultural confidence in the old adage that the surest path to personal success and achievement of the American dream was to work hard and play by the rules. And of course, this was seen not only in the economic sphere, it was also seen and has been being seen in the political sphere as well, and in other areas of our lives. We see great promise here for scholars in popular culture to utilize Q because it gives voice to the informants of the popular culture, people who are determining what's popular and what isn't. And again, remember that generalization is of the mode of responding and is not to any demographic. So in factor C, we noted men play at work because it was all men, but it was a limited number, right? It was, I think, 5 Q sorters. Certainly can't claim that that is uniquely a male point of view. And I thank you for your attention and welcome any questions and discussion.
And you can always, if you feel a little shy, you can always just put your question in the chat. I'd be happy to read it.
I just want to say it's so interesting. It makes me want to watch the series again. I have to dig it out.
How many, just show of hands, how many watched the show? And it really, you know, and I have to thank Dan Thomas particularly. He was the one who suggested that we do this study. I think Breaking Bad was into its, I don't know, 3rd season or 4th season. And I just had never seen the show, so I had to binge it. And it, to this day, remains the best show I've ever seen on television. So I'm thankful to him that just for having watched the show, because I'm not sure I would have otherwise.
Saying I started watching it because I saw you present an earlier version of this paper at a Q conference.
Ah. And I think Steve came along at that point too, didn't you, Steve, or were you before that?
Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, I didn't come before. In fact, the entire series may have been over when I got roped in. I may have seen the last, episodes in order, but I came by it. I kept seeing the advertisements for it, and I keep hearing the hoopla, and I said, "What's this all about?"
Yeah,
I don't think I got roped into it until late, and I can't remember what the influence was. It may have been you in one of our coffee clutch meetings.
It could have been because I was overwhelmed by it when I saw it.
Oh,
I do
Joanna
recall
has a question. Sorry.
I do recall that one of the most important influences was when what's his name, Anthony Hopkins, sent a letter or something to the star Walter.
Bryan Cranston.
That was the best acting he had ever seen.
Wow.
And from Sir Anthony Hopkins to say that, I thought, I've got to see this.
Yeah, that's high praise.
Yeah, it is.
Joanna, you have a question?
I do. So thank you. I think I was not a Breaking Bad fan, but I was a huge West Wing fan. And I was, at a political science college studying at the time that it was reaching its height, and we were all geeking out every week together and all watched the podcast for the next decade after the show ended. I guess listened at that point. So I feel like there's a lot of resonance that I have with that feeling of being a super fan. And then those different subjective experiences. So I really appreciated the ability to kind of pull back and see that. I think, what's really became top of mind for me is this common theme in our Monday group. We've been looking at a lot of these different issues around empowerment and emancipatory approaches, or at least I bring them up every week. And so it's a really interesting theme, taking different disciplines and this idea of how do we put the operancy back in so many of these disciplines. And it seems most obvious, I guess, that in popular culture, we should give informants the ability to speak to that subjective experience. So I was wondering, really, if you could speak to some of us who are interested in that idea of how we put the operancy back in, I'm thinking, for example, deliberative democracy, or, lots of other contexts where we want, where people matter, where their opinions really should have a say. But we're trying to shift an academic culture that maybe disempowers. And maybe so you could speak at a higher level, maybe to your experience of trying to bring that operancy back into a community.
Yeah, I think that's really well said, and I agree with you. And I know that there have been studies that have been done, for example, on and Steve, you've done these when it's about land use or some topic of concern to the public in a local community or something of that sort, to give them that kind of say, and those kinds of things have been done. The resistance, of course, is going to be from elites. And when I say that, I mean not only the business people who might have wanted to do something else with that land and think that they know best, or, and as you allude to, academics who don't want to give up the privileged position of telling everybody what these people really think, and instead of letting them say for themselves. I think we all, in our various fields, I think we all struggle with that question to a degree. It's but I think it's very important, and we just need to keep pushing ahead with it. We've, at least in the United States, well, in other countries too, in recent years, there's a crisis in democracy. And so voices have to be heard, right? Or they're going to be stymied. And so, yeah, I think we all do that. That's what Q does. But of course, you also have done studies of elites, right? And their view, because they're still going to have a big say in a lot of these various matters. I remember a study that a colleague of mine at Westminster and I did on U.S. foreign policy, and we got a piece set of experts to do that, right? Because they know the issues. So, but if it's a macro issue like war, right? What are we going to do in Afghanistan or something like that? We certainly want the public to weigh in. So, yeah, I sympathize with that position, and I think that you'll find that that's a common thread in what most of us do, even if it's not the explicit thing that we're doing, thinking about. And I welcome others to contribute to this conversation, because I think it's an important topic.
I have a question, if you don't mind.
Surely.
Good. I noticed that the Q sort was theoretically driven.
Yes.
Correct. The statements themselves, were they compiled through interviews, or was it from the researchers that compiled the statements? That was part one, and then
okay.
I have one more follow up, but I'll start with that one.
Okay. The statements came from a public commentary that had been written about the series, either by critics or by general public, and we gathered hundreds of them, and again decided to use that as a theoretical basis. Michelle's 4 modes of transparent or 4 modes of mediated audience response.
Okay. And then, yeah, part two is I think your findings had 3 factors.
Yes.
And 2 of them corresponded to the theory, but one seemed unique to the theory. I'm just, in terms of contribution to the future literature and the I guess the contribution of the study itself, what are the implications of that?
Yeah.
Is it unusual that one factor is outside the theory?
Oh, I don't think so at all.
No. Okay.
I don't think so at all. But in that particular third factor was a mixture of 2 of the modes. I mean, you could see strains, but what it really had to do with was just with a sense of what's all the hullabaloo about. And, that's a factor that probably would show up in any number of studies that would be done about something that was super popular, right? I can't imagine that would pop out on a television show or a movie that had sort of middle response to it. But something that, you're probably going to have a group of people who are going to say, yeah, I just don't get it. Why are people talking about this? So that may be a fifth response or a 4B that Michelle might want to consider.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Yeah. But thank you for the question.
Yeah. Thanks. Well, one more, if you don't mind.
Oh, no.
I noticed the sort grid itself. You used the word, it was flat, so the kurtosis was less shaped. What was the rationale for that decision, if you don't mind?
Yeah. Boy, I know this is something that Dan wanted to do. I typically don't have them that flat, but he thought that people were going to have a distribution that would have, they'd want to put more things at the positive and negative end. But it was really his call. That's really what he wanted to do. And I think it worked out well. It's also with I think the only thing that I would have done differently is probably have one fewer statement at the extremes, 3 instead of 4. But these are the trade-offs you make when you work with co-authors, and I don't think it really would have affected things much at all anyhow, statistically. But I think, as I recall, that was his rationale for wanting to do that. That these were people who were invested in the program, and they would have no trouble finding 4 and making those determinations, as best as I recall. But I do remember that we had that discussion.
Go ahead, Steve. You go ahead.
To add to that, that was very good advice on Dan Thomas's part, because if there's less uncertainty, and these, as you say, we're all experts and quite familiar and had definite points of view about it, so there are fewer things that they're going to be uncertain about, and so you want to have fewer things in the middle. Whereas if it was some topic like the desalinization of water or something like that people don't have strong views about, that there are a lot of items in the Q sample that they haven't come to a conclusion about, then you want to leave more room in the middle where they can throw things that they hadn't really developed fixed views about. So, as we all know, the distribution shape is not going to have any effect on the outcomes. You're still going to get factors A, B, and C. But that probably made the Q sorting itself more comfortable, because people could agree and disagree with more items and with fewer in the middle.
No, I think that's right. I think my only hesitation was that I like to have the fewest amounts at the very extremes, because I think it sends another cue to people that there is this rank ordering that goes on, and that Or if you see that there's only 3 statements under -4 and 4 statements under -3, that so for me it's almost aesthetic rather than. But as you say, it doesn't make any difference.
Yeah.
It doesn't make any difference. But to me, it's just another Q, CUE for the Q sorter.
All right, I have a question. Have you thought about reaching out to, was her last name Michelle, and sharing your findings to see what they thought about how you kind of confirmed 2 of the 4 and threw in kind of a 5th idea?
Yeah, I can tell you, I'm sure that she's read it. That I'm certain of. Her significant other, I don't know if they're married or what, or they may not even be, they may not even be significant others. I take that back. They're collaborators a lot, and I don't know why I had it in my mind that they might be an item, but his name is Davis. He keeps a running tab of all of the things that have been written on audience response, especially with Q methodology. In fact, published a bibliography of all of the Q methodological studies. So, and I know that they've had some discussions on the list and so forth. So they have been off and on contributors and so forth. So I know that she is aware of it. And we may well have sent it to her. I don't remember.
So Gareth wants to know if you publish this paper or this study in a popular culture journal.
We did. This was published in a journal called Participations, and you can find it online. It's an online journal. And for a while, they were publishing quite a few Q studies. Then the editor, I think, got overwhelmed by the number of Q studies and has taken a somewhat dim view of Q studies being submitted. So, but yes, you can find it. The journal's called Participations.
And Rita has her hand up. She has a question.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Rhoads, for this really interesting study. My question is kind of, I'm sorry I didn't have the opportunity to read your chapter, so I'm going to ask you in person. You said that you also conduct research by looking at another TV show, Jersey Shore, and I was wondering, and I also want to connect my question what you just said about the fact that this journal published studies on popular culture based on Q. So did you see when you analyze Breaking Bad and Jersey Shore, you found those groups, did you see any kind of regularity in the type of viewpoints that emerged, or the groups that emerged, they were kind of more related to the specific story they were describing?
Yeah, that's a real good question. There were some similarities. There were character identifiers in the Jersey Shore study, and there was one factor that really was anti a character on the show who calls himself the Situation, and they were in favor of some of the other characters. There was also a factor, and this doesn't apply to Breaking Bad, but there was a factor that watched the show because they got some comfort in the fact that these people's lives were a complete train wreck, and theirs wasn't, or at least not compared to the characters on the show. So they enjoyed watching the escapades of these young people on the television show and essentially saying, well, thank God that's not my life. So there were some similarities, but a little bit of differences. and in the Jersey Shore study, the P set was made up of college students, so they were the same age group basically as the members of the Jersey Shore.
I have a question I'd like to pose, and if you already talked about this, I apologize. When creating your Q set using the 4 sort of dimensions that you created, did that cause it to be, or did it make it harder for you to create a cohesive set of things for people to sort? Because one thing I'm worried about when I think about how might I try to make something balanced and something that's also representative, but then also trying to address 4 things at the same time, I feel like that would be very challenging. Can you talk a little more about that?
Yeah. Well, one of the things, of course, is that once you create the set, or you think you've created the set, you should go through it, Q-sort it yourself. And that will alert you maybe to some problems, potentially. We didn't feel that we felt the Q sample was well representative, and we felt that it was, we had no one had trouble doing it. No one. So I think there are things that you can do. And again, remember that these were all modes of the way people responded to a program, right? So I just don't think that there was is an issue to that. The foreign language or the foreign policy one too was structured, and but again, as long as you're attentive to it, as long as and it's really important to do it yourself. I don't know if anybody else wants to add to that.
I know what the pitfall is. The pitfall is starting with those first 4 categories and try to fit everything into that, rather
Right.
than using that as a theory to sample the 200 that you've already collected.
That's right.
I think what happens when people try to generate by theory, so what I think is embedded in Erica's question is this idea that I'm going to start with these 4 and now everything I find put in them.
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. Yeah, you're right, Diane. No, that's right. No, that stage came later. The first stage was just generating as many statements as we could.
Those statements already existed, right? You didn't, when you say generated them, they were statements that already existed in the wild, so to speak. They weren't
Yes, they
things you
existed
made
in a
up.
while. When I say generated, I'm going out and capturing them. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think that's part of Erica's question too, and Diane, good response to that, because the language and the expression and the points of view about the movie already exist, and now we're saying, well, given that people have said this, and here's this theory, where do these comments that naturally exist get in? So you're not constructing something artificial, because these things exist naturally.
Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah.
I
These
often-
are things that people have said.
Sorry, I talked over you, Jim. I often think there might be something outside of the theoretical frame that you saw in the concourse that you need to include a 5th category for. So you don't have to be so tied to your theory. You want to be able to represent that big wild fishnet of concourse in the best way possible.
That's right. And you can, and I've done that too, where I've created sort of a 5th category of just kind of other, that you see strands of people saying certain things, and they may not be reflective in the theory per se. So you got another category of sort of other, or I've done that as well.
Jim, I have another comment. It's sort of a little postscript. It's about Breaking Bad. I wasn't a fan. I didn't watch all of it, but I before the fire had a place in New Mexico, and my sister came out to visit me when I was in New Mexico, and I picked her up in Albuquerque. We had to go look up the address, and she was so upset. She said, "There isn't a basement. This house does not have a basement."
Yeah, Bruce McKeown did the same thing. He sent me a picture of it once.
I have a picture of the house too.
Yep. Yep. Said the same thing.
Oh, Vivian has her hand up.
Hi, Jim.
Hi, Vivian.
Long time no see.
Long time no see. That's right.
Yeah. Well, I have to tell you, my husband was a diehard fan of Breaking Bad. I mean, he would eat, sleep, and oh my God, it drove me crazy with Breaking Bad. But anyways, I hope this is not a ridiculous question, because, I'm still learning about Q methodology, which I love tremendously. How did you pare down your hundreds of statements to just the size concourse that you did? I mean, nobody really talks a lot about that, but how do you do that to make sure that you're capturing and have the representativeness in the theory that you're trying to adhere to during the study? How did you do that?
That's a great question. In this particular instance, the three more veteran Q methodologists in the study, Bruce, Dan, and myself, we selected our favorites from the 200 or how many ever we had, and then we traded back and forth and to talk about it, and eventually came to it that way.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I was just going to jump in 1 second. I have a draft email sitting in response to this thread that Professor Brown and others have been on around factor interpretation the last couple of days. And what I find really interesting is this idea, kind of like you were pointing to, that sometimes when we have these preconceived theories going into it, it can put blinders on in terms of being able to see the much wider world that might be connected to the ideas there. And so a lot of my ideas are more connected to how we maybe consciously or unconsciously use discourse analysis when we're looking at our factors. So I guess I was wondering if you do that consciously in terms of, because of course my mind jumped to some of the almost anti-women statements that you read, and wondering if they're, if I, as a researcher, I would want to go down that thread of maybe those follow-up conversations to understand if there's more underneath that than maybe I was getting in the post-sort interview or something. So yeah, just kind of how do you go with those inclinations when that stuff comes up?
Yeah. Well, you got to follow the factor, right? And so what is the factor telling you? And I think it's been said in that thread, I think Sue was the one who responded, that it's a holistic approach. So it's right from the whole thing. It's not, I gave you representative statements at the top of the factor, but if you read through the factor array, they would be reinforcing ideas. There's nothing wrong, I don't think, with, as you suggest, asking in the follow-up interviews, why was this statement so important to you? And let them talk about why it was. And it might have well been, I didn't like the misogynistic ideas in this statement or something like that. And then that would give you additional evidence that something like that was going on. Okay? So the interviews are quite important. As are the external data that you can gather, right? I mean, as I said, it was eye-opening to me how many of these people could name by name the episode, right? That they were so familiar with the program that they knew the names of the various episodes. That was something that I didn't expect, and it further indicated to me that these people are truly fans I mean, they self-identified as fans, but we were dealing with people who were quite expert in the subworld of Breaking Bad. So I don't know if that answered your question or not, but if not, please ask again, or ask me.
Yeah, I think no, you started getting there. I
Okay.
think that, you know, I guess what I'm wondering partially is sometimes when these things crop up that we don't expect,
Yeah,
which is one of the beauties of Q, is when
right.
we start to see these factors that cause all of our curious alarms to go off, because they weren't there when we originally started looking at our concourse and putting the statements together and really honing them down. And so how do you follow up on that? Let's say that you maybe aren't in contact with a sorter anymore, and
Okay.
you are playing with everything after the fact. I'm also relatively new, although similar to Vivian, have gone deep dive. But I come out of a lot of qualitative research. So for about 10 or 15 years, I've done a lot of qualitative research methods. So how do you push into those intuitions with the data after the fact?
Well, I think you've got to acknowledge in the first instance that these are speculations that you have based on the data. These are intuitions you have. And I think it's going to require follow-up study. I don't think you can make that grand pronouncement at that particular time. But it might be that, oh, wow. For example, we speculated that this program was resonant because of the economic crisis of the time. That's speculative. You know, we could create and go back to these very same people a sort of socio-political kind of set of statements about Breaking Bad within the context of a economy that was in free fall and whatever else. And then we might be on firmer ground about saying that when these factors emerge, about what is that saying. But I think it requires a follow-up study. Other thoughts on that?
I was just thinking that it would be really interesting, you know, this many years later, if you could have the same people sort the same statements and see if anything changed. Like if it was, you know, something they were obsessed with it at the time, but now they would be hard pressed to name an episode, for instance.
Yeah, sure.
Or do Better Call Saul and see if what happens.
Yeah.
Well, isn't it true that the factors that emerge has a lot to do with the people who are doing the sorting? I mean, it's like who are you selecting to do the sorting? That has a huge impact on what factors emerge. Would you not agree?
Except for the notion that those factors results are themselves generalizable, so that there are presumably, more than presumably, there are other people out there among Breaking Bad fans who would sort those statements essentially the same way.
Who are the people who sorted? I mean, if I could ask that question, who sorted? Who are the sorters?
These were all people that we asked. Some of them were my students, some of them other people that we knew, just people that would self-identify as fans of the program.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Really self-identify as super fans. You know, not casual fans, not people, oh yeah, I've seen it, but you know, they had to be people who were really, really invested in the program. I had people who asked me if they could do it. I had a colleague, a historian, who heard that I was involved in this research, and he said, you know, my 20-year-old son and I watch this every week. We want to do this Q sort. Fine, great. So, you know, those two were in it just because they heard through the grapevine that this study was going on and they wanted to be a part of it. So
I just got one quick follow-up with that, Jim, if you don't mind. And you talked about this earlier, and that is the distribution. You said it really didn't matter what the distribution, the grid was like, and you could have more positive versus, you know, and more negatives versus and more in the center. Can you just speak to that for the sake of the newbies, why that doesn't make a difference in terms of distribution?
Yeah, well, yeah, a couple of things about that. The first is that we want a quasi-normal distribution.
Yeah.
Because it requires people to make choices, and we want them to make choices. I think most of us, at least most of us who have done several Q studies, every now and again encounter somebody who says, oh, I can't do this way. There's 4 statements I want to put in under +3, and you're only allowing me to put 3. So, you know, you say, well, do with it as you will. Just, you know, it's theoretical in that we want them to make as many determinations as they can. But Steve and others have demonstrated that there's really no statistical difference. So when I say it doesn't matter, that's what I mean. But the factors are going to stay the same. But again, and that's why I was saying earlier, I like to have, you know, at the very extremes, in this case, +4, -4, I like to have at least, you know, 1 fewer than the others. And again, it's just, for me, it's schematic. It's not anything but. And because I think it does send that additional cue to the Q sorter that, oh, I should find only 2 here instead of 3, and that kind of thing. But it's not going to matter. And
Thank you.
Steve or Sue or Diane, if I've misspoke there, please correct me.
Then Gareth wants to know why just super fans and not more casual fans.
That's a good question. I think what we were trying to do was find out this appeal. It was this sort of blockbuster program that was getting all kinds of attention. And so I think at root, we were trying to find out why that was the case. But certainly you could do a study with, you know, people who are casual fans as well. And they may find different things in it. But we wanted the super fans because we wanted to know what the appeal was. We wanted to know what was driving their interest in the program. And I hope that you can see that this can be used.
Thanks.
Oh, surely. That this can be used in all other kinds of popular cultural aspects as well. I know Steve's done studies on people's response to poetry. It can be done with music. It can be done with literature. Dan Thomas and was it McKeown or Boss with Thomas who did the Bridges of Madison County?
Yeah, I don't recall. Thomas was the lead.
Thomas was the lead.
Yeah.
But one of his
McKeown,
Kent State colleagues went in on with him on that. And so that Bridges of Madison County was, and I think that may have been what gave Dan the idea originally on this Breaking Bad study, was because the Bridges of Madison County was an incredibly popular novel at one time. And that prompted them to do that study. What's its appeal? Why is this book taking over the world? And so it can be done in any level. I've done probably 4 or 5 on various aspects of popular culture. I've done on the movie The Believer. Dan and I did one on All the President's Men. I did one on the, what was the name of the movie? It was a very controversial film on that depicted the assassination of President George W. Bush, Death of a President, that was it. And it got a lot of critique because, of course, there was no assassination of George W. Bush, but they used what looked like real footage. And George W. Bush was the sitting president at the time that this film was released. And so it created a lot of controversy. the believer study was a study of stills from the picture, and the respondents sorted the stills after having seen the film. And so there's all kinds of things that could be done using Q methodology and sort of gauging and measuring audience response. I started down this path because I read an article Stevenson had written on the immediacy of reacting to the immediacy of a film. And he didn't really do it, but he invited people to do it and said this is how it could be done. And he did it with, I think, a documentary, if I remember right. So I shouldn't say he didn't do it, but it was more of an invitation to others to go down this path. And so I thought, wow, this would be a really cool application and of Q methodology, and and it didn't seem to me like anything had been being done with this. Steve might remember this. I was in graduate school and I came up with a Q sample for Oliver Stone's JFK, which was popular at that time and very controversial. That never saw the light of day, but I did do the Q study. It was so my interest in this goes back at least to Oliver Stone's JFK, which is more than 30 years now.
So when you think about it, it's all communication theory.
Yeah, exactly.
Hey, I wanted to mention, Jim, several years ago, Arlene and Terry and I did a Q study, which has some overlap with this one. The condition of instruction, though, was quite different. It was, why do you read fiction? And the statements, and I think we created the Q set from journaling that my students had done. And we did come up with 3 factors, and one of them, very important one, was relating. I want to relate to characters. Another one was escapism, and then there was a third one that looks a little bit like a combination of 2 of those theoretical positions that Michelle had. But that was interesting. Also wanted to say that your factor 3 sounds kind of scary to me in terms of how vitriolic these people were, hating this female character. And what's curious about that is, weren't these the same men who said, well, it's just a TV show?
Exactly.
Why get so worked up? It's just a fictional character.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Did you ask them who they supported in the last presidential election? Or?
No. Although I do know one of the sorters, or one of the 5, and I can tell you that he most definitely did not vote for Trump. And that's not me. I'm not saying I was one of the 5. I know someone literally who was one of the 5. And unless they've been lying to me all about their politics, they did not vote for Trump.
Okay.
Right. Well, Jim, thank you very much for staying over. This was such a great presentation and a great post-presentation discussion. So
Thank you. It was great fun. And thank you so much. And I, again, just my appreciation to the group who organizes this for dedicating a number of sessions to the book. And if you've not yet got the book, please look it up, and because I think you'll enjoy it. Ah, okay, there you go.
Yay.
I think you'll enjoy it. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, and hopefully we will see at least some of you next Monday when we have a regular discussion. I believe we have a February presenter, but I don't remember who it is. Anybody remember who it is? Miku, do you remember who it is?
It's our other Gene Good, I think, actually.
Oh, okay.
That won't be till the end of February 27th, I think it is. So we'll just formal weekly sessions run, but yeah, that's who's up next.
Awesome.
All right, well, great.
Thanks,
Great
everybody.
Great seeing
Thanks,
you all.
Dr.
Enjoy
Rhoads.
the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.